Hi, Len Riedel again with the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'm speaking to you about our June 1997 program, Gettysburg, the Second Day. And I have the distinct and awkward privilege of introducing myself as the first speaker. What I did in trying to broaden the appeal of the organization and to broaden the appeal of touring battlefields to spouses coming along with their Civil War buff spouses. I concluded that maybe it would be necessary to have a Civil War primer, because Gettysburg was such a really important and significant battle that anybody getting into the Civil War for the first time, they may not get into Chickamauga or Vicksburg or Pea Ridge or Bentonville, but almost everybody knows firing on Fort Sumter, First Manassas, and Gettysburg and Appomattox. Usually, that's the core that most everybody understands. And so I said, well, what we'll do is we'll put together a program the evening before we get started, before all the big names came in which folks could just get, if you didn't know a whole lot about the Civil War, if you didn't know much about Gettysburg, I was gonna give you the cheat sheet so that so you'd feel comfortable and at least could feel like you and your spouse or your guests would have something to talk about and perhaps enjoy the area a little bit. And so I wanted to spice it up with some of the color of Gettysburg, which is a wonderful 18th, 19th century American city town. So we set this thing up for the evening beforehand, and lo and behold, I had 40 or 50 people show up for it. Everybody's spouses came out. It turned into an event. What I thought was just going to be maybe for a handful of people turned out to be the opening event of the program. What was funny about this, one of the funniest things to remember, and I don't know whether this is going to come through on the tape because I haven't watched it cradle to grave yet, but I do remember specifically in setting this up, my dad decided he would record it, and so he set it up to record. As I was talking to people and stuff, my dad fell asleep recording the thing. And he fell over and he had hurt himself. It was just kind of a little embarrassment, a little disruption and a distraction from what I was doing. But you really know how important you are when your father comes along to help you and he goes to sleep on you. So there's a lot of humility, and I learned humility really early on in the Blue and Gray, and so I'll never forget that. Almost 25 years later, and now my dad is 89 years old, but at the time he was 65, and we were having a good time in these early goings, working together on these. It was a great father and son get together over a period of time, and so in this introduction, if there is some disruption, maybe if the tape falls over, the camera jilts or something, I think probably it made it. If I think I gave my dad a little bit of grief about that, and so that probably makes this video as well. But this is not a real highly sophisticated talk, but it's a talk about the Civil War. It's Parker Hills likes to call it a skill level 101 talk about the Civil War to help people understand basics and stuff. So for something light, sit back, relax, and enjoy me 25 years ago as I present a primer on the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg. To understand that the whole idea of developing a functional country, one of the most basic units of sovereignty is the ability, in other words, the identity as a country, is the ability to demonstrate to the world that you can defend yourself, that you are recognizable, and that you're a formidable force in whatever you do. The South was born under fire, as most of you are aware. Very rare in history has a country ever been formed with its major antagonist literally on the boundaries with it. not only did they have to form a country, form a government, and form an army in some sense of nationalism, they had to do it under a very careful microscope of a border that was literally more than 1,000 miles long, and with all types of political intricacies that we're working on with that. So very early on, there is a major debate within the Confederacy as to the proper method to prosecute a war. There is one school of thought that says, husband your resources. Don't waste those resources, but wait and accept the attacks of the enemy. All you have to do is not be beaten, and you will win. Eventually, if you can hold on and allow the enemy to exhaust themselves and to lose their will to fight you, then you will have the possibility of a repeat of what happened with the American Revolution, where somebody may come in and side with you for very different political reasons. They may come and side with you because they believe that you're going to stick around, and if they hang their hat with you, they're not going to be embarrassed in the international political arena. Well, what happens in the American Revolution? The American Revolution, there is this minor thing going on over in the States, in the New World, but even more important, what's going on in there is this interrelation that's going on in the Old World between France and Spain and England and all these people. These people don't like each other. They have been fighting long before there was ever any thought of an American Revolution. And the formula there was such that once the French found that there was a reasonable opportunity to get in there and to exploit the weaknesses of the British, they entered in on the side of the revolutionaries with the ultimate expectation that they would get something out of that. And so, as we all know from our history books, the French intervention in the American Revolution was decisive. That ability to bring in that established military force came in and assisted Washington and his fledgling army and assisted them in establishing their independence. What is the similarity? Why raise that point when we're talking about the Civil War? Well, there is a similar thought that is going on in the minds of the Confederacy. This is an organization that is very functionally weak. It has no sense of identity as a real region because the nature of the South is basically agrarian. These people don't necessarily know their neighbors. They don't live in big cities. They're farmers. And so their belief is that if they are involved and they can select a formidable ally, if they can play off their strength, cotton, if they can play off that need in the Old World, they have a reasonable expectation that they may in fact achieve their own independence. So consequently, what's going on in the New World right now? What's going on in Mexico? There's a revolution going on in Mexico. Who's involved? Who's intriguing in Mexico right now? The French. How about that? Is there a similarity? So what do you have going on there? You have very early on an attempt on the part of the Confederates to establish some means of political identity with the Old World to offset the fact that there is no Navy in the Confederacy. There is no means of establishing and guaranteeing open ports for trade with the European countries. So there has absolutely got to be a means to establish some degree of credibility for the Confederacy because they have got to be able to import a great many goods that they need if they are to be viable at all. So this whole concept of how do you make yourself viable in the eyes of the established countries of the world is a very legitimate concern. It is so much a concern that in the early part of the war, what happens when a British mail ship off the coast of Bermuda is stopped by a Federal man of war and they take off two Confederate envoys, Mason and Slidell. Mason and Slidell are en route to the port of St. James,
to talk to Queen Victoria and ultimately Prince Albert, and they're also headed for France. Their purpose in going over there is to say, look, we have got what you need. You've got these textile mills, you've got these things. We're the same old folks. We've always been that you've dealt with for years and years. You don't have to deal with those industrialists in the north. You don't even have to mess with protective tariffs anymore, because the sovereign state of the Confederacy is going to grant you very favorable trade status. And if you recognize us, you won't have your factories, your costs are going to go down, you're going to have access to all the raw materials you want, your factories are going to thrive, you're going to be able to sell to us, you're going to draw what you need. We're a good deal. You don't have to worry about North, you don't have to deal with it. And incidentally, if you deal with us, hey, there's Mexico down there. Monroe Doctrine doesn't affect us. We're not interested in maintaining sovereignty over the Western Hemisphere. All we want is our independence. That's the message that Mason and Slidell are to carry when they're intercepted. What happens? Do you think Abraham Lincoln is afraid of European intervention? Absolutely. Ultimately what happens is Charles Wilkes gets all the credit for taking these men prisoners. He's lionized in the north. He's considered to be a hero. The two envoys are imprisoned in Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. But ultimately what happens is Prince Albert in England intervenes and says, you know, we don't really want to mess with these people. We don't want to be that involved. Let's wait and see what happens. And Abraham Lincoln looks at that and he sees forces beginning to build in Canada, and he says, one war at a time. And so that issue is diffused, and the whole issue of whether or not the Confederacy is going to get this intervention is once again joined. It is a question of what is the Europeans going to do? Because they'll intercede, there's something to be said, and they may in fact achieve what they need, which is military intervention and breaking of the blockade. So, in this mindset of trying to establish this credibility, the issue is one, you might have walked into this room with an expectation of competency on my part. You're sitting here because you expect me to know what I'm talking about when I speak to you. Now, at the end of 35 or 40 minutes, you may walk out of here and say, boy, was that 40 minutes of my life gone. I don't need to do that anymore. And credibility is gone. Well, the same principle applies in this war. This is the thing you've got to worry about. And so consequently, the idea of taking and invading the North is a very risky proposition. What do you risk if you go north? You risk defeat. And if you're beaten on the battlefield, your political agenda is gone. If you lose on foreign soil, you have just wiped out one of the basic underpinnings of your credibility on the international arena. So when John Bankhead Magruder comes down in April of 1861 and advises Robert E. Lee and John Letcher in Virginia, hey, I've just come from commanding an artillery battery at the gates of Washington. They know me. We can walk right in. We can take Old Highway 50, the Baltimore-Washington Pike. We can occupy that. We can take Washington. Let's do it. Letcher and Lee say, wait a second, we don't even have anything that constitutes a viable force. Sure, we could walk right into Washington, but could we hold it? And if we didn't hold it, what would be the ultimate result of that? And so they knock it away. But yet, Magruder writes that same letter, and he writes to Jefferson Davis, and he says, President Davis, here's the situation. We'd really like to, you really ought to do this. So there's a lot of this going on. What is one of the great fighters of the Civil War is Joseph E. Johnston, right? A man, well, I don't want to get into it. He's a former son-in-law, or brother-in-law. My former brother-in-law was his great-great-grandson. Joe Johnston has got a philosophy. As he's sitting there staring with eyeglasses up around Manassas and Centerville with George McClellan, he's telling Jefferson Davis that what they need to do is they need to bring all the forces, strip the coast, bring forces from everywhere, put the whole army together, and invade the North. If we invade the North, that will force McClellan out of Virginia. The Yankees will fold up their tents, we'll get recognition, we'll win our independence. Done deal. And Davis and Lee say, no, you don't understand. It's not going to be this way. We can't risk that. What is Johnston's strategy when he pulls off the peninsula? Ostensibly exactly the same strategy. He is advocating in April of 1862 that what we can do is, Magruder's got enough men down there on the peninsula to hold McClellan until we move north, and then McClellan will have to give up the peninsula. There will be no battle. We'll invade the North. We'll win our independence. So this is an underpinning that deals in the very basic nature of how the Confederacy is going to prosecute this war, what they're going to allow themselves to do. And so this whole concept of back and forth, do we need to be in a defensive position? Do we just want to sit back and receive the assaults of the enemy and not be defeated? Or do we want to take a proactive position? Do we want to go out here and hit the enemy, strike them a decisive blow, and win the war by doing so? This is a strategic debate, a war-level debate that is going on in the Confederacy. Enter Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is clearly, the legend does not necessarily do justice to the man and to the soldier. Robert E. Lee, in fact, is a very aggressive, competent, and qualified soldier. Winfield Scott said he was the best soldier he ever saw. And in fact, as many of you are aware, Robert E. Lee, Colonel Robert E. Lee, was offered the command of all the Union forces prior to resigning his commission and going south and accepting a state commission. Not a Confederate commission initially, a state commission. He did not intend to draw a sword against the United States. He only desired to defend the state of Virginia because left with the option of either drawing a sword against his brothers or defending his state, his sense of personal honor was such that he could not draw a sword against his fellow countrymen. So here's Robert E. Lee sitting there, but Lee is a war hero. Lee is directly responsible for many of the greatest successes of the Union Army in the Mexican War. Robert E. Lee ostensibly he's an engineer and he's a thinker, and he's always looking to move offensively. That is a basic principle of war, and Lee is probably the most aggressive person you would ever want to meet in your life. I've forgotten, I think it might be a story, I think it's probably second or third hand information, but when they talked about Lee, they said his name is audacity. He will take more chances, he will take them faster than anybody. And so you've got a man who is now ascended to the command of the Confederate Army, and he is going to be the person who's going to be responsible for making the decisions as to how the Confederacy is now going to prosecute this army. What's his pedigree for doing it? First off, Robert E. Lee has been the advisor to Jefferson Davis not once but twice. When Davis brings the Confederate capital and Confederate government to Richmond, Virginia, from Montgomery, Robert E. Lee, who's been commanding the Virginia forces, is also commissioned in the Confederate forces. He becomes the primary military advisor to Jefferson Davis. Lee has an incredible amount of savvy, and he understands the role of dealing with a man who first off was a colonel of the 1st Mississippi Rifles, who was the Secretary of War. Robert E. Lee has been the superintendent of West Point. So Robert E. Lee understands this interrelation that occurs between politicians and military people probably better than most anybody else did. Stephen Woodworth has written a fine book called Davis and Lee at War, which is a sister volume to the book Jefferson Davis and His Generals. And in that book, Woodworth makes the point that Lee is successful throughout the entire war precisely because he does understand the needs of his president. He understands the frailties of Jefferson Davis. He knows what Davis needs. He knows how to encourage Davis. And he knows how to get Davis to move in the direction that Lee thinks ought to be done. And that's a very important point to remember. I'm going to emphasize that point. The relationship between Davis and Lee is such that when Robert E. Lee proposes a strategy, Jefferson Davis acquiesces and allows Lee to do as he pleases. So, if you understand that first basic tenet, you begin to understand how this is going to begin to unfold. What happens in 1862 in the Peninsula Campaign? Lee decisively defeats George McClellan. He doesn't destroy his army, but for all intents and purposes, he has defeated an army as utterly as an army can be beaten. He has taken, in the military vernacular, in the terms that military men use in evaluating how you win or lose a campaign, Robert E. Lee has taken a man who had a strategy, who had a mission to go to Richmond and take Richmond. Not only has he taken and cut the head off of George McClellan's plans, but he has whipped that dog and sent that dog scurrying all the way back down to the protection of gunboats on the James River. Robert E. Lee has beaten a Union army more decisively than any army has ever been beaten in the history of America. And he does it over 7 days. He pays a huge price for it. It is part of the price of being aggressive and offensive and moving forward. But he has achieved his purpose. He has driven McClellan away from the streets of Richmond. Having done so, and having taken the measure of his opponent, because he sees that McClellan is a young man, he's only 35 years old, McClellan has lost his nerve. Lee realizes this, realizes that McClellan no longer poses a threat to him, and now begins to think, how can I prey on the insecurities of Washington? Well, he's got some examples already. Stonewall Jackson's 1862 campaign has already taken and scared the living dickens out of Abraham Lincoln and the government in Washington. Jackson has already been north of Washington. Now, Washington sits down here, and Jackson's been up to Harper's Ferry and up into Maryland and so forth. And he's turned around and he's come back. He has done the best work he can do against Banks and Shields and Fremont. And he has had a very, very fine time. And that lesson has been learned. The Union is very insecure about their own territory. What sort of message would you send to the world if Abraham Lincoln and his government of black Republicans had to leave the nation's capital and set up the Capitol in Philadelphia or New York? What a tremendous, tremendous coup. The ability to force the hostile government out of their capital and send a message to the whole world that the Confederacy is viable, dynamic, alive, and well. So after McClellan is beaten down on the peninsula, Lee begins to look for means in which he can now shift the initiative. He's taken the initiative, but now he wants to move, and he wants to move in a decisive manner. He's got a man who he is perfectly suited for this in Northern Virginia, commanding the Army of Virginia, the newly constituted Army of Virginia, John Pope. John Pope, without being exaggerating, is a man who really doesn't have much of a concept as to how to move a large army. Many people don't. But Pope has put himself in a position in which his army is threatening, and not only is that, but he has made himself persona non grata within the Confederacy. He has made a lot of bombastic statements which have earned him ridicule from the Eastern military establishment of the Union, but have also earned him the dislike of the Confederacy. He is called a miscreant. And why is he called a miscreant? Because John Pope has the audacity to think that friendly Southerners who happen to be behind his lines shouldn't be behind his lines, so he expels them and sends them to the enemy country. And that is so foreign to the conventions of war as they understand it, that it offends everybody, including Lee, and Lee says he must be suppressed. And he finds a way to do it. What is his instrument to do it? He sends Stonewall Jackson. And then he brings James Longstreet. As soon as he's certain that McClellan is not going to do anything, and McClellan is finished. Make absolutely no mistake. McClellan has no intention of going anywhere. He is sitting right where he wants to be. He is telling the world and everybody who will listen to him that if only Abraham Lincoln gave him those other 50,000 men that had been withheld from him, he'd have crushed the rebellion. But since he's done the best, he even wrote a letter to the president. He said, "I've done my best, and you have done your best to destroy this army. Lincoln never sees that letter because the War Department clerk snips it out as so insolent that that it's believed to be offensive enough that nobody should see that. But Lee understands McClellan. McClellan's finished, he's gone to the war. So now Lee turns and he sends Jackson up to go take care of Pope, and Pope is such a buffoon in terms of military skills that Lee is able to make a decision, and Pope doesn't even realize it. Jackson sweeps around on his rear, destroys the supply chain, and basically causes Pope to begin starving. Pope turns around, I guess it's kind of like a stegosaurus being attacked by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, doesn't really understand how this is going to turn out. Pope thinks, I got Jackson just where I want him. I'm going to knock the heck out of him. Ha, ha, ha. That's not going to happen. Not only has, once again, has Lee turned around the Federal Army, but he's got that army pointed back towards Washington. And when Lee gets done making mincemeat of that army, now he has got a decision to make. He has sent Pope fleeing back out of Virginia. He has destroyed Pope's army. He has destroyed McClellan's army. The Federals, in exasperation, Lincoln turns to McClellan and is told, McClellan writes his wife and says, "Once again, I am called to save the nation." Do you think that Robert E. Lee is really seriously worried about George McClellan? So Lee now entertains the point in which he says, okay, we have achieved all that we can achieve here. We have sent every Federal army we have faced, we've sent them scurrying back from whence they came. Now the time seems propitious for entertaining the thought of entering the North. And Lee makes that proposal to Jefferson Davis and is given permission to do so. Results in the Maryland campaign of 1862. It is really intended, he's intending to go to Pennsylvania. In fact, as he sets up, he has got James Longstreet, his leading corps commander now. Longstreet is sitting in Hagerstown, Maryland, not 20 miles from here. Governor Curtin in Pennsylvania is in absolute panic, is calling forth all the militia and everything to come forward because Lee is coming to Pennsylvania. Well, what happens to Lee in Maryland? 12,000 men, Nelson Miles. Here is this garrison sitting at Harper's Ferry. Lee still, no matter how audacious he is, still must feed his army. An army has got to have a lot of sustenance every day, tons and tons of it. And the manner in which Lee will always feed himself is via the Shenandoah Valley. When you look at those maps, and when you drive, any of you who have driven up 15 or whatever, you look at the South Mountain chain behind us here, between the South Mountain chain on the other side, you have got this valley. And that valley is a highway right back into the granary of the Shenandoah Valley. That's how Robert Lee intends to feed himself. Sitting right in the middle of there is Harper's Ferry with 12,000 Federal troops. Lee cannot go to Pennsylvania. He's got 12,000 Federals sitting on his food chain. So he's got to take it. And he does so successfully. He sends Stonewall Jackson, he splits his army up into multiple pieces to cover what he's intending to do. It's a tremendously audacious move in the face of an enemy that he doesn't respect. The enemy moves slowly from Rockville, Maryland, moves into Frederick, discovers some orders wrapped around a cigar, and now all of a sudden still takes 28 hours to do anything. That's decisiveness for George McClellan. But then as they move forward, Lee realizes something is wrong, and the campaign really is basically over. Now, Lee takes and captures 12,000 men. By any stretch of the imagination, a successful military operation. But what has failed in 1862 in Maryland will also fail in October of 1862 in Kentucky, and will also fail in Missouri. In each instance, invading Confederate troops going into border states have carried a declaration of independence for the border states, telling them that they have come to liberate them from the yokes of federal oppression. The army is here, embrace us, we're ready. And what happens in every single instance? Indifference. The people who are going south are south. The people who are in the border states have made up their mind. They are not interested in taking sides because right now the battleground is Virginia. If Maryland declares for the Confederacy, the battleground is now Maryland, and life hasn't been good in Northern Virginia for a year. Don't think it's going to get any better in Maryland. And so all of these political entreaties failed. So the great Confederate maneuver, the Confederate attempt to demonstrate to the Europeans that they are a viable force has risen and failed just before the 1862 congressional elections. What invariably happens whenever you have an off-year election of a presidency, the incumbent presidency, if he owns the Congress invariably begins to change, and it shows a reflection of dissatisfaction of the country in the direction it's going. What happened to Bill Clinton in '94? He lost the Democratic majority and the Republicans came in. Lincoln has problems in 1862. However, they're made a little bit better by the fact that Robert E. Lee and Braxton Bragg have all failed in their efforts to move forward. So the war settles back in, but the issue is one which is never far from the minds of Confederate leadership. The ability to operate in the North is still considered to be a key component if the Confederacy is to achieve their independence. And so, as 1862 concludes and they move into 1863, there is still this mindset in the leadership of the Confederacy that ultimately the success of the Confederate forces is going to depend on the ability to operate successfully in the North. Mind you, there's no thought that they're going to stay there. I mean, there's no way that Robert E. Lee ever goes north with the intention of spending 2 or 3 months in the North. The invasion is really a raid. It is a unmounted infantry raid which is going to go up and perhaps get the attention of people enough so that maybe there will be active debate in Europe and maybe there will be intervention. But ultimately, every time Lee goes north, he knows he has to come back south again. He's not going to live in the north. April 1863, Lee has got such a problem that he's actually split his forces. He has won at Fredericksburg, not a very difficult thing to do given the tactics of Amber that Burnside was laid. But Lee has realized that there are things that really need to be done, and one of the things that needs to be done is southeastern Virginia has to be pacified, northern North Carolina. James Longstreet, the senior lieutenant general, is a man who aspires to have 4 stars, who believes himself capable of commanding an army, believes himself capable of independent command. And so Longstreet is the senior advisor to Robert E. Lee, and he has been for some time, and Lee is listening to him. Longstreet is down in Suffolk engaging in a campaign ostensibly to collect forage to help feed the army. When everybody gets back there, to reduce the demand on the army in camp around Fredericksburg. So, early May 1863, new federal commander Joe Hooker, who had replaced Ambrose Burnside, steals a march on Robert E. Lee. It's a brilliant maneuver. Absolutely classic textbook turning maneuver, and he caught Robert E. Lee with his breeches down. He held Lee in front. In other words, what the Federal Army did was they continued to show enough of a front in front of Fredericksburg that Lee couldn't be certain that he could turn his back and go deal with the threat in his rear, which is always the advantage of a larger force. That's one of the really understated advantages of the manpower discrepancies between North and South is that if I've got all of you people here and I've got you 2 people to keep me occupied in front, and you're all I can handle is just one of me, and there's 2 of you, there's still 2 of you, and I've got my hands full dealing with you, and so consequently, you can send them around on my rear and cause all sorts of trouble for me and force me to leave. And that's exactly what Hooker does. He steals that march in May. Well, Lee turns, once again, a lack of resolve on the part of the federal commander into a weapon that he achieves perhaps his greatest victory of the war. And in doing so pays one of the most profound penalties that the Confederacy was to experience during the course of the war, and that was the mortal wounding of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson's death and subsequent burial, May 9th, throws the Confederacy into a huge depression. But in the midst of all this depression, because Jackson is just so tremendously important to the psyche of the emerging Confederacy, there is still this mindset. Longstreet has come back, but now you got a problem. Robert E. Lee's army has alternately moved between 55 and 80,000 men ready to fight battles. Now, for those of you who have never contemplated this before, I'm going to try to put this in some terms that perhaps can give you some magnitude of this. I come from the city of Danville, Virginia. How many people have been through Danville? Okay. Not a small town, not a huge city, but not a small town. Population, about 35,000 people. Street to street, everywhere you go, that's the sum total of population there. Hagerstown, Maryland, most of you have been to Hagerstown, 35,000, 40,000 people. If you took and emptied those two towns out, and you just put them all in a line in the street, and you marched somewhere, that's about the size ultimately of Robert E. Lee's army. It's huge. We don't really get a sense of what 50 or 60 or 80,000 people are. Can you imagine how much they eat? Can you imagine the difficulty and logistics of moving that? Can you imagine the difficulty of commanding a force like that with two people, James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson? We don't have Jackson anymore. So Lee, after Jackson's mortal wounding, Lee has got an important decision to make. Who's he going to raise to command? Well, he looks things over and he makes a selection. He decides instead of just replacing with one corps commander, he's going to split, he's going to reduce the span of control of Jackson's old corps, and he's going to create two additional corps. Now, for those of you who don't understand the nature of the descriptions of Army forces, let me briefly tell you what they are. You have an army, the big picture, the big enchilada is the army. The fighting unit of the army, a small army, it's even called in the French term corps d'armée, is a corps. About 25 to 30,000 men. That corps is organized on the days of Napoleon and Napoleonic tactics. The corps is operated and organized to fight as an independent small army. So the selection of a corps commander, in effect, is to put together a whole striking force, an ability to fight as an army. That's why Lee only has one corps. Lee hadn't given up a great deal. He's given up manpower, but he has got an organization with Stonewall Jackson that will allow him to fight. He's got a four-day army, one corps. He splits this down, and he assigns one to Richard Stoddard Ewell, and the other one to Ambrose Powell Hill. A couple of youngsters, not that old. What's happened to Richard Stoddard Ewell? Ewell's lost a leg. Ewell suffered a vicious fight, a vicious wound at Bronner Farm at 2nd Manassas in August of 1862, and he has to leave the army. He's a major general. He leaves the army, and his leg is amputated. He marries a woman, a widow Brown. He goes around and introduces everybody. After he gets married, there's a story that he used to introduce his wife to people. He said, "I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Mrs. Widow Brown." But there's another point. We laugh about that, but a significant element of that is that if you have ever lost a significant part of your anatomy, they talk about people's phantom pains. You lose an arm and you sometimes still feel your arm and stuff there. This man has lost his leg less than a year ago, about 7, 8 months ago. That's pretty traumatic. Not only that, but now he has experienced this euphoria that seems to afflict all men and women at some point or another, where he has fallen in love. And so he is extremely susceptible to the love and affection and the dominant, pervasive influence of this person that he's married. So Richard Stoddard Ewell is not the same man he was when he ate some lead at 2nd Manassas. And people often ask, not complimentary either, they said, who's commanding the unit today? Is it Mrs. Brown or the general? That question is being asked. So that's one corps commander. And remember his name because his name is important here at Gettysburg. Second was Ambrose Powell Hill. Hill commands the Light Division. What has Light Division done? Hill arrived there as A.P. Hill from Harper's Ferry. Hill arrives at the last minute, smites Ambrose Burnside in the flank on September 17, 1862, drives the Federals back down to the Antietam Creek, where the battle is settled and Lee's army is saved. This is a man who has now earned a spot in the leisure domain of Confederate heroes. It is A.P. Hill from Harper's Ferry. You have heard that term, you've seen it in quotes. Robert E. Lee said it. So, in selecting these commanders, Lee elects to elevate these two inexperienced corps commanders, half the inexperienced, and neither one has had a corps before, but he promotes both of them to lieutenant general, and he gives them a new unit. Now, what's the problem that you face? How many people in here have served in the military before? Okay. Have any of you all been commanding officers of a unit at any point? Okay, you all understand. The problem with a commander, when a commander comes into a new unit, the people have to understand the commander has to understand the people. You have to assume the commander has a confidence in what they're doing, and there has to be a trust and a bond built between these folks. You have just taken an army, a corps, and you have cleaved it. You have taken divisions, which is the next level below a corps. You've taken divisions that were fighting with one group under Jackson, and you've given them to Ewell, and you've given some of them over here to A.P. Hill. You've brought some from Longstreet. You've put them into things. You have created a new matrix. One would think, after something like that has happened, that these folks are going to take a little bit of time to get used to each other, to understand what people need. That, too, is an important point to remember. Stomp a foot, because you need to understand that to understand what happens on July 1st here at Gettysburg to get us to July 2nd. So, you've had this tremendous upheaval, and now what do you do with this army? Well, Joe Hooker's not coming again, and so what has Lee invariably done? What is happening north of the Rappahannock right now? Joe Hooker is eating the heck out of Northern Virginia. So, what does Lee have to do? He's got to get these people out of here. If he turns around and heads south, he abandons the line of the Rappahannock. He can't do that. So his choice is to go north. So he dusts off that old plan again, not as naive as he used to be, and he says, we're going north. And he goes north. And he works his way, with Hooker still standing there wondering what is the meaning of life. Lee starts heading towards Winchester, Virginia, to that pipeline in the Shenandoah Valley, and he starts spreading out his army. Well, I'm going to do my Ed Barker thing. Spread out his army. In doing so, what's the first thing that happens as Lee begins to make his move towards Pennsylvania? What happens to Jeb Stuart at a place called Brandy Station? You betcha. Not only that, largest cavalry battle in the history of the North American continent, but he has severely, the day of the battle, speak cavalrymen, whoever saw dead cavalrymen, right? The day of the battle, they're planning a grand review. What is Stuart like better to trot a bunch of horses past Robert E. Lee and a bunch of ladies? In the meantime, the Federals are about to whip the hell out of him. And there's a battle. And they just barely hold on to their to both their dignity and the ability to screen the Confederate Army. So Lee moves north with a bunch of young people. He doesn't stop in Maryland this time. He heads for Winchester, and then he heads on up through the northwestern part of Virginia, and into Maryland, and into Pennsylvania. He goes as far as Chambersburg. He goes as far as Carlisle. He occupies Carlisle Barracks. If you ever go up there, take a look. There's signs up there that talk about that. Come on in, read it, please. And in that maneuver, Lee has such a contempt for what is going on there. He may go to Baltimore. Nobody really knows where he's going. I'm not sure Lee knows where he's going, which in and of itself will lend to a very interesting question later on. But for right now, suffice it to say that Lee has now taken the initiative. He has gone back into the North again with the potentially large payoff that will come, from operating in the North. And in doing so, what is the first thing this is a loaded question. The first thing that you must accept is that Robert E. Lee cannot go north of the Mason-Dixon line and then go back to Virginia without fighting a major battle. All this stuff about Lee not wanting to fight a major battle is a bunch of poppycock. He's got to fight, he has got to beat the Federals somewhere decisively. You can't go up there and then leave a perception to the world that when the going got tough, we got going. It's the antithesis. Robert E. Lee is going to fight. That is the nature of who Robert E. Lee is and how Lee does his business. So Lee is looking for a fight. I mean, I want to Gettysburg, but somewhere along the line there's going to be a fight. He's got to do it. What happens? The Federals all of a sudden come to realize Lee is gone. Lee is doing something. We've got to go. Joe Hooker turns around. He heads back toward the north, commanding the Army of the Potomac, under the impression he's not Abraham Lincoln's favorite general. And for those of you who are not aware why he's not, he is intrigued. He is a political general, and he has undercut everybody he has worked with and has achieved his own success through discrediting people who he worked for. So he's not very, very reliable. He's not trusted. He's not necessarily liked. And so when he goes back to Maryland, he says, "Oh, here comes Robert E. Lee. We got to do something. Here we go. I got to have those troops that are back in Harper's Ferry. Got to have them. Got to go take care of Lee." He's told, "I'm sorry, you can't have those troops." He said, "I beg your pardon. You can't have those troops." He says, "Well, Robert E. Lee's in Pennsylvania. You can't have those troops." He says, "By golly sakes, I'm the commander. The enemy is in hostile territory, in our territory. If I can't have those troops, I resign." Accepted. Joe Hooker is gone. What happens? Lee is sitting around munching and enjoying Pennsylvania Dutch chocolate or whatever else they had up there, and the Federal Army is in disarray, and one of Hooker's former corps commanders, George Gordon Meade, a Pennsylvanian, who had been a division commander under Hooker at Antietam, commanded the 1st Division, had taken command of the Army. En route, at the very point, I'm not sure, I don't remember the day of the change of command, it may have been the 29th of June, wasn't it? 28th of June. Within 2 days, there is going to be a scrap right here. Well, Lee is spread out all over the place. He's going to have to concentrate his forces, and you're going to get into some of the other controversies. Dick Sowers is going to talk about this, so I'm not going to get into those, other than to say, what happens, and what you'll want to understand about this event, is that as these armies assemble, Lee realizes there's going to be a fight on the morning of June the 1st, or July the 1st, rather. Skirmishing takes place west of the town here, at McPherson Ridge, Hare Ridge. John Fulton Reynolds, the Federal First Corps commander, is shot and killed near the woods there. The Confederates have a very successful day, with a few exceptions. The first success they enjoy is that they do, in fact, put unbearable pressure. The Confederates, to understand how this battle is joined, people are beginning to pour resources into Gettysburg. Lee has the good fortune of getting the resources into Gettysburg faster than Meade does. as Lee brings his corps in from Carlisle and the areas up there and so forth. I'm doing well. I put my father to sleep. I love it. You want to know what's humbling is when your dad falls asleep when you talk. But, oh, not good enough for you, huh? Lee is more successful in getting these forces called back. They are all making hay, coming back to Gettysburg. And in doing so, as they arrive and pour into the battle on the west side of town, the pressure is irresistible. And the Federal line is busted off of McPherson Ridge. It is busted off Seminary Ridge. And the Federals flee back through the town as the Confederates begin to join hands in this outer ring that is now going to move forward against the Federal forces. In the meantime, the Federals, with inner lines of communication, have still got to make a determination as to where they're going to stand. And the first place of defense they attempt to stand is right down here where the National Cemetery is at Gettysburg, at Cemetery Hill. They're under the command of Oliver Otis Howard, O.O. Howard. Now, what is Howard famous for? Because you understand this as well. Howard is the man who has the misfortune of being in command of a corps that is routed, the 11th Corps that is routed at Chancellorsville just a month and a half before. He's not the most credible corps commander you have in the Army of the Potomac, but yet he is a senior commander there on the Hill, and he is on that hill until the immortal Scott Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock, arrives as the envoy of George Gordon Meade in Reuton, says, "I'm in charge," and Howard is smart enough to realize, I don't need to fight this battle right now. Okay, whatever you're going to do, General Hancock, do so. They set up their defenses there, and the battle begins to take shape for the second day. Now, what you will see and will hear in this, and again, many of you are familiar with this, but keep in mind, in this time of war where there is no such thing as an Air Force, we don't have F-16s, we don't have Star Wars, any of this other stuff, he who holds the high ground is the Daddy Rabbit. And if you hold it, you remember the old game, King of the Hill? Many of us played as kids. You come up, I'm King of the Hill, and you try to come up the hill, and somebody up top throws you down. You're the King of the Hill. The Federals have found commanding ground. But it shouldn't have been that way, because just a few days before, Richard Stoddard Ewell had been through Gettysburg en route to Carlisle. He had seen the territory here. He had seen the various positions and so forth. Not having the eye for detail that Jedediah Hotchkiss and Thomas Jonathan Jackson had, it just aired right over him. Yeah, he'd been in town, he'd had something to eat down at the inn or something, probably stopped at Frappert Inn or whatever. He had been there, he'd been through. But in coming back, Robert E. Lee issues discretionary orders to Richard Stoddard Ewell coming to the field. He says, if you deem it practical, take Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill is the highest eminence over here on the defensive line of the Federal Select. If you take that position, there is no place in which the Federals can put in any positioning this side of Gettysburg. Their next position will have to be Pipe Creek, some miles farther toward Washington. So Lee issuing these orders in a discretionary manner says, you're in the best position to decide, General. If you can take that position, take it. Ewell comes up, it's the latter part of the day, his men have been marching hard all day. It is not a foregone conclusion that they can have that position for the taking. If you will see it while on Saturday when we go that way, that position has some very precipitous terrain, and it doesn't take a heck of a lot of imagination to understand that whether it be 100 men or 1,000 men trying to climb that hill, that is a pretty rigorous physical challenge for anybody. So the fact that Ewell does not elect to take that position in and of itself is not totally destructive to the Confederate plans. It is a lost opportunity, but not a foregone conclusion they can do that. But why does it not happen? Well, Ewell doesn't necessarily have the same eye for detail that Jackson has. Understandable. It's his first battle in command of a corps. So that opportunity is lost. And then as the rest of the forces will come to this field, they will line themselves up. And the great gamble is that no matter what you may hear about James Longstreet, and I urge you to probe that question this weekend about the idea of a strategic offensive, tactical defensive, whatever. But the fact of the matter is that the enemy is here. I'm going to strike them. I must strike them. It is not a decision that Robert E. Lee can turn around and walk away from. Say, hey, just sorry, guys, you got here faster than I thought you were. I'm sorry, I'm leaving. And I'm going back to Virginia. Don't bother me. You know, there are some people who are modern constructionists of history who would have you believe that if all Robert E. Lee had done and listened to James Longstreet, they said, hey, I'm sorry, all we want was a pair of shoes. We don't want to fight here. You got a better battleground we can fight at? No. The battle is here. The armies are here. There are going to be nearly 200,000 men here. 25% of them will not leave here on July the 4th. They will be in the hospitals, in the streets, and in the fields, and in lonely areas buried behind trees and rock outcroppings and so forth, because they will pay the ultimate sacrifice for this decision to fight here. It is an important and cataclysmic battle. It is arguably the most memorable battle in American history. Certainly it is one of the most well-known battles in American history. It's a very fascinating study. I hope that you'll find, when you're done here in a couple of days, that you understand at least this portion of the battle better than you did when you came here. And even more than that, I hope you understand now why Robert E. Lee and the Confederates came to Gettysburg. They had to fight. Things were desperate. They weren't all gone, but they were desperate. And there was a long-standing tradition that said that one manner of establishing your sovereignty as a nation is to establish military primacy on the enemy's turf. That's what they were doing here. That's why they fought here. That's why they won't even leave after the second day, because the battle is not yet decided. And we know what history happens. We know what's said after this. But it is a pretty titanic struggle. So that's what I had to say. I really didn't expect to have to give a talk tonight. I really thought we had 4 or 5 people. But I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope in some small way I've contributed to a better understanding as to how the armies got here and why they got here. At this point, it is 9 o'clock. I'll ask you if you all have any questions or anything you'd like to talk about. Certainly don't feel compelled here. If you've had enough and ready to go to sleep, you can get up and walk out. I don't get offended easily. And my father just woke up, so. But are there any questions that I can answer for you about this?
Would it even been feasible for Lee to disengage after the first day? I mean, with the number of Union troops that were here, he would have been turning his back on a force that would have chopped him to pieces within 12 to 24 hours.
Great point. I think that probably one of the, you remember 91? Remember once we had isolated the Irish, or the Republican Guard of the Iraqis, and we had locked them into Basra, and we had cut them off from all their supports, and the determination was made that they had to retreat. I think your point is right on the button. I think once 2 armies get in proximity without being separated by a significant geographical obstacle, that the ability to disengage, you and I, these 4 people facing me are a formidable force. If you turn your back on me and start walking out the door, and you've given me enough latitude that I can catch up with you, and artillery is a lot of latitude, you know, and wagons are some very slow legs. So, you know, if you've got an army and you're trying to move 60,000 people back through territory that is going to be contested, ask Napoleon what happened when he left Russia. Ask any retreating army that has ever had a lengthy retreat that they had to go through what their successes were, and we have found that many armies have been shattered and destroyed in the retreat in the presence of the armies. So once the battle was here, once it was joined, my opinion is that it was impossible for him to disengage. without fighting further. Yes, sir.
Just a process question. We're going to have lectures here tomorrow.
That's right.
Will we have an opportunity to dress for the afternoons in a different way than we do for the morning?
Good question, and the answer to that is I wouldn't think you would, because what we'll do is we'll finish the lectures, we're going to have lunch next door, so for you to change to field gear, it would be at the expense of your lunch period, and something I'm very religious on is I do keep things on schedule. You know, everybody in here is entitled to that, so I do keep things within a few minutes one way or the other. So if you wish to change, it will probably be on your own time during lunch. Other questions about this? Yeah.
In the way of some background information, and I know you don't mind giving along with mine.
So you tell me you would.
Yeah, okay. General Sickles got himself beat up, I guess, pretty bad in Chancellorsville. And I had heard that it was because of his position. He was caught on some low ground. And I never really heard the details of it.
Sickles was not really on low ground. In fact, Sickles, the seeds of what are going to happen here, I believe, are sowed at Chancellorsville, because Sickles holds a salient at Chancellorsville at Hazel's Road. So Sickles has already been in this position of occupying dominant ground, and once you go out and you take a look at this terrain, here's Dan Sickles. This whole army is coming in at late on the evening of the 1st, and they're deploying, and they've just had a really bad experience during the course of the day. The rebels have whipped them in every spot, and now he is told to hold the position. Well, when he takes a look at that position, he slides down the thing. Cemetery Ridge actually gets down and is actually down to the ground of the valley at some point. And he takes a look at that, and then as he looks out over the position, it is his perception that the peach orchard and the wheat field and Devil's Den offer him the best position for defense. And based on what he's already experienced, he was on the Emmitsburg Pike, he believes that position from his view is actually higher ground than what he has behind him. But in doing so, it's the most difficult position to defend. In a military sense, as a salient, because you can be attacked on multiple sides, and that's what he creates. Instead of a steady line with a force linked on the big round top, he has now extended a force which can be broken and attacked this way and attacked this way, and if it's collapsed, now there's a big hole in the middle of the line. That's the tremendous mistake that Sickles makes. He can't stand judgment. Because if the line is broken on any spot, he's lost the position, and in fact, he's lost the position in the army. And Seminary Ridge is achieved on the second day. That's part of the thing that makes me believe that the center's going to be weak, because the Floridians have actually been on Seminary Ridge on July 2nd. So he believes if he can take that, of course, he gets the ridge, he can turn his cannon in either direction, and that's the end of the Federals is off, and got to leave, he's won the battle. So that's why his frontal assault is not as far-fetched as you might think. However, I'll plant the seed in your mind when you go out in the field. The position I think you really want to look at on this field, you're going to be drawn to the round tops and this other stuff. But if you're thinking about where the best place to win the battle was, pay attention to Terry Jones's talk and go take a look at Cemetery Hill at Evergreen Cemetery. That is the Federal salient. And had Lee hit that point with as much force as he hit farther down, he may very well have busted through that and achieved that ability to shoot down either way. So give that a hard look and test Ed Barr's hard on that. Push him on that point. He'll appreciate your savvy. Because I think he agrees that's a point the battle probably could have been won by the Confederacy. Other points, questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Lance, you might prime up a little on these mental and physical that
Okay. It's hard. I'll try to give this something that you can relate to, because this is really the only way I think to understand this. This man has had the weight of a country placed on his shoulders. the amount of stress, if you look at a picture of Robert E. Lee when he entered the Army, he is a handsome, rich, brown-haired man. By this point in the war, he's white already. Can you imagine? Do you know how much stress it takes to turn a person's hair white? You have lived a hard life. And Robert E. Lee has been under pressure since April the 20th of 1861, and he's got a heart problem. He doesn't get out and do aerobics every day. He works late hours. You know, something a lot of people forget about these officers is that the battles are primarily fought early in the morning because they don't have daylight savings time. So you see a lot of attacks start at 4:30 in the morning, which means that position troops to start these attacks, you've got to have troops up at 3 o'clock. If you're about to command a group of men going into battle and they're supposed to move at 3 o'clock, what time do you think you're likely to get up in the morning? And how often are you going to do this? And if you're 56 or 57 years old and you've got the weight of the whole army and trying to figure out what's going on here, you may be dealing with 1-2 hours sleep. You may go an entire day without any sleep. And if you had this kind of stress on you, the submission is that Lee had at least 1, maybe 2 heart attacks during the course of the Civil War. So, and anybody who's had a heart attack, I haven't, but I understand just this crushing pain that you feel on your chest and so forth. They don't get up there and somebody says, oh, you need an angioplasty. No, they sit there and say, oh, and they just back off and you just try to catch your breath. Well, if Lee has had a heart attack, he's got a bad stomach, he's got this pressure and so forth, and now you're asking him to make good, solid, hard decisions and to lead troops in battle or make decisions about leading troops in battle. He is considerably debilitated. Is he more debilitated here than at other points? I don't know. I think he probably has more stress later in the war, but certainly this is a supreme effort for him. And again, look at the difference between two. Grant is late 30s, very early 40s, probably Lee is a generation older than he is.
Len, I would think more appropriate to the circumstances at this point is Lee's apparent sense of invincibility that he had on the second day.
Yeah.
I mean, after Chancellorsville and after the first day, I mean, his army just could whip anybody.
Yeah. And I think, you know, to just piggyback on that for a second, what Ron is talking about is that one of the essences of being a great commander in the military is to believe that the impossible can be done and that the absolutely extraordinarily impossible just takes a little bit longer. And here's a man who has achieved success in everything he has done. He believes totally in these people. He will ask them to achieve more because if he doesn't believe that they can achieve that, if he doesn't ask them to achieve it, they certainly will not achieve it. There's only one case in the war that I'm aware of where a general did not expect his troops did not ask his troops to do something that they didn't fail to achieve that thing. That was when troops carried Missionary Ridge at Chattanooga, where the expectation was all they were to do was to take the rifle pits at the base of the hill. And these men, although their mission was only the rifle pits, they believed that they could do more, and although the general didn't believe they could take the ridge, they did in fact take the ridge by their own volition. But if you as a commander will not accept the challenge to believe that your people can do the impossible and ask them to do the impossible, they certainly won't extend themselves to do it. So I think you're exactly right, Ron. This was the first time that Lee had asked people to do something maybe impossible to do. I'll take one more question, and then we'll break down. Anybody that wants to talk further, we can do that. Any other questions?
What do you think of the school of thought that, in addition to all the things you've already said about his mindset at this particular point after all the bloodshed was the one how would you factor that?
As far as Gettysburg,
He thought this could be the
oh, okay. I think the question is, does Lee hit and continue to hit here because he thinks this might be the end of the war? I don't think Lee had a reasonable expectation that he was going to completely destroy the Federal Army here. I think that his work was incomplete. I think that Lee evaluated the reports that he got, The first day is clearly a Confederate victory. The second day is pretty much considered to be an incomplete victory, but a victory nonetheless. I mean, it's what happens on the right is considered to be the best 3 hours of fighting the Confederate Army ever did. So as Lee takes this data in, I think that this is just the culminating point of this particular episode. I don't think that he believes, this is speculation on my part, and speculation is always dangerous, but I don't believe that he thinks that he's going to win the war here on Cemetery Ridge. I think that he must win this battle, and I think he perceives that he has not yet won the battle, so therefore he must hit before he turns around and leaves. If he leaves after the second day, again, he is conceding the field to the enemy, and that is widely regarded in military terms as a concession of defeat. So Lee believes he has won the first day, he's arguably won the second day, and he has achieved Cemetery Ridge on the second day. He believes that he may in fact sweep the Federals from the field, and if he wins this battle, then he can reasonably leave and go back to Virginia again. He will achieve his purpose. Then the political aspect can kick in. Then Jefferson Davis may send an offer to the federal government to sue for peace. But Lee has incomplete work here, so I don't think that this battle at this point, I don't think that Lee really perceives that this bloodshed must stop. I mean, here's a guy who said in February, it's well worth a terrible lesson to the farm of it. So, and now we're talking 6 months later. I don't think Lee really becomes disillusioned with the prospects until he realizes just how badly Grant has bitten him in the Overland campaign. I don't think Lee realizes after he whops Grant on multiple occasions and he inflicts a horrific casualty at Cold Harbor, and Grant just bites on that leg again and holds on even further. I think that once Lee found himself drawn into Petersburg trenches, he'd always known that was going to begin. And I think at that point, I think Lee probably began to believe that the war was going to end at that point. But I think at Gettysburg, I think he's probably still riding a high tide of martial ardor, and I think that this is an uncompleted task. He's fought 2 days, he's won 2 days, he must finish the job, he's going to hit here. I think the mindset probably takes place later when he realizes that he's not replacing what he's lost. Okay, the start tomorrow morning, I'll be happy to answer other questions, but I did promise y'all to try to be finished here at 9 o'clock. What you have also gotten, incidentally, is the way we do things. You'll get a 45-minute talk